You're listening to Development Works, produced by Doctors for Doctors and Nurses for Nurses. Hello friends, I'm Andrew Wilson.
And I'm Michael Carlson. This is Development Works for January 2017. And on today's upcast,
when doing international development, the best organizations stay small.
We hear from Tim Rudkins, a man who refuses to be censored, with a ton of experience in international development.
Now, Tim is someone that I would consider an expert in international development. He's worked as a finance manager and in programs management in all sorts of places: Nigeria, Botswana, Sierra Leone, Ethiopia, Nicaragua. I mean, I'm basically running out of breath as the list goes on. And he's worked for organizations that are huge, such as CUSO or CARE International. He's even published in fields of microcredit and NGO development. And today on the Upcast, Tim lets us know what works for international development.
But first, this Upcast is powered by Doctors for Doctors and Nurses for Nurses. We're a Canadian charity that sponsors the medical education of high-potential youth in rural Nicaragua. So if you want to ensure everyone has access to quality health care, first, visit doctorsfordoctors.ca.
One of my favorite stories of international development, screw-up, was in Sierra Leone. So the World Bank in the 1960s went into Sierra Leone, and Sierra Leone, I don't know how much you know about Sierra Leone, but Sierra Leone used to be a very advanced country. It's very small, extraordinarily rich, in the sense of all sorts of minerals and diamonds and everything. It had a beautiful coastline, huge fisheries, etc. And once the slave trade sort of slowed down, it was a very big thing for the UK. They had very big universities there, famous universities, who actually produced some great scholars and everything else. It was a neat country. The World Bank went in the 60s and 70s and did a big study of all of Sierra Leone. And Sierra Leone had this incredible train system. It was throughout the whole country, stops everywhere. And at every one of the stops and every one of the villages, there was a nice strong village, which was good for agricultural. All the agricultural produce would come in, all the other trade items. This train would stop. People would do all the trading in the market that day. They would move on. Incredible structure. Very, very neat. The World Bank in the 70s recommended that Sierra Leone tear up the train system and put in a modern road system. And then when the government of Sierra Leone said no, the World Bank held loans back from them until they did. So what they did do is they tore up all the tracks, sold them to, I think, India, and then, because there was no tracks and there's no roads, the entire rural economy of all of Sierra Leone basically completely fell in. So now when you cruise through Sierra Leone, you'll see these what were fabulous little towns with marketplaces, etc., completely semi-deserted, just laying about all over the place through the 80s and 90s and the 2000s. It was disgusting because these so-called World Bank economists thought that trains were an old-fashioned idea. And if any of you have ever been to Asia, like the Indias and all that, they ain't a bad idea at all. They're a real good idea. So that's what large organizations are making it too complex or getting involved in other people's countries and planning can do. Yeah. So stay out of that. Stay out of trying to be smarter than the locals. Support the locals. Shut up and listen lots, and get involved, but in a very positive way.
And that was the first of many great stories Tim Rudkins got to share with us up close and personal at our live presentation of Development Works in Toronto this month.
Andrew, shut up and listen. It's advice that my grandmother, I believe, gave me, and also advice from Tim there. So what do you take away from this story besides that, Andrew?
I really connected with the ideas around listening to the local populations. I mean, especially or even when it doesn't make sense in our own context or lens, work with local organizations and actually defer to them in the decision-making process. It seemed really important.
Yeah, I didn't know anything about Sierra Leone before this, and I can't believe how they had all that infrastructure. They had a thriving rural economy, and then it just came in and got annihilated by some outside external force.
Yeah, it's amazing what kind of harm a bunch of people trying to do good can end up causing. In this next story, Tim talks about working for a huge organization, CARE International, and the difficulty of a large organization has on being able to hand off a project to the local government.
This story really hits home for me because I know so many nonprofits in Canada that have these flagship programs that they would just never give up, like no matter what the local feedback was, no matter what.
Yeah, and I find this story really impactful because we're a small organization trying to grow, and this made me want to stay small. So here's Tim.
Where else? Again, worked in Niger for a number of years in the field of microfinance and enterprise development. So I worked there for 4 years, and we set up banks. My real expertise was setting up what they call microfinance institutions. So those are loans to the poor. There's a bunch of famous ones all over the world. We were the largest at the end there in Africa. It was huge, tens of thousands of people and training and blah, 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 blah. And that was with an organization called CARE International. And I was the regional guy, and also it was my project that set up this bank, Bankenraya Karkara, which is the Hausa word for it. Good thing about it is that we saw thousands of people take small microloans, and we measured it. So we actually saw them take their loan of, and it could be anywhere from $20 to $1,000 or $2,000. They literally would start businesses because we vetted them, and we did what's called a group loan process where everybody guaranteed each other, which basically comes out of Asia and a couple of the big banks out of Bangladesh and India. So what we did was every year we would measure asset growth, which we thought was very good, as well as child weights, maternal health, blah, 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 all these nice little statistics. We just did it by ourselves. And you did see a dramatic improvement in the people who took the loans and started the businesses. So all of a sudden you'd go in 1 year literally and they'd have 8 goats and 1 cow, and their house was a dump. And then you go back a year later and they'd have 15 goats, 7 cows, the house looked a little better, and one of the kids was going off to school. And you would note all those down in the charts, and you could see a dramatic difference in people who had access to liquidity, to cash, to start their businesses. So what worked there was the ability to give small loans in an economy that was liquidity dry. They didn't have any way to get loans to start businesses. So that was very useful. What really sucked was large organizations. CARE International is a very, very large organization. Don't like to give up on projects. If something is sucking in the money, which this thing was very, very popular. We had visitors from all over the world, the head of Coca-Cola, everybody was there. Congressmen used to come by all the time, blah, blah, blah. And they don't like to give it up. So the whole idea of spinning off the institution with the cute idea of sustainability was never even discussed. And when it was discussed, people were fired or shunted off because that brought in, usually in those days, I don't know there's all these different measurement statistics for how much is left in the country, and most of them are BS, by the way. But 85 to 90% of the money goes to US or Canadian expats, right? And the trucks and the offices and everything else, which isn't a bad thing if there's something else being left behind, I think. So that's one of the big is not good necessarily. It usually sucks. Large organizations usually stuck. Large complex projects are usually a bad idea. Small local endeavors. One of the women I work with there started up with women's groups, local funds called Roskas and all, which are where the women save up a certain amount of money and then lend it back to each other every month to start some. That is still going on and going on quite well. And her project has really extended across the country. She hasn't worked there for years, but the people are still doing it. So it brought basically an Indian concept, Indian and Bangladeshi concept into Africa and started working very nicely. So those local things really do work. The big money coming in usually destroys and standard stuff.
Microloans, man, so genius, and they've been around for a while now. And the other idea there, the idea of liquidity, right? I've never heard of that before, but it's just this idea of how much money is floating around in the economy that people can grab for things like loans, and that's going to hugely influence the overall success of the economy. And all that good is just being done by the simple ability for somebody to borrow money.
Yeah, just this idea of stay small, stay true to your values, and give local populations access to borrowing money.
Yeah, it's pretty straightforward.
I found it interesting how he reflected on the small organization at the end doing something so similar and keeping true to its values. And although I get that well-run organizations doing incredible work need funding for things like advertising and paying good staff.
Super important.
But when you sacrifice your values to get there, I guess it's just not worth it.
Yeah. Another fascinating piece was the group accountability that Tim talked about, right? For paying back loans. Like, there's a social pressure on you for paying back, and all of your colleagues, your neighbors, your friends, they're going to like obligate you to pay that back. Anyways, moving out of the world of microloans and into research and development work.
Tim's next story I really enjoyed on many different levels, Mike. As soon as I thought I could trust a study done from the World Bank, this guy comes in and shares a story about how absolutely nonsensical their methods were while completing a study done in Ethiopia.
So is the moral here, like, don't trust the World Bank?
At least not on access to loans in Ethiopia in the 90s. That's what I'm going with.
That's specific.
I worked in Ethiopia for a long time, just to give you an example on that, to show you how stupid a lot of the big ones are. I worked there with the World Bank for a study, and so we went there for 4 weeks. And the World Bank, we all flew in, blah, 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 and we go into this big goofy hotel. And so every day I went out to do a study on Ethiopia, and I had all these economists from the World Bank in there. And I would go out and go to the markets and go talk to all those business people and find out what's going on. And Ethiopia is one of the most advanced financial systems the world has ever seen. Like, it is the coolest place you'll ever see. Because they're an old people. They're no stoops. They've been around a long, long time. Ethiopians were lending money across to India 500 years ago, 600 years ago. Like, that whole thing was very well developed, right? So I went in there and I found like 20 or 30 different types of lending organizations, all informal in the markets. You'd go in and there's all these little micro banks with guys where they'd raise up their thing and you could borrow money at different various rates. They dealt in multiple currencies, etc. It was hilarious. So it was a great, like, it was very cool. And they had no problem with liquidity. The guys in the World Bank guys who I was partnering with, they brought me in because I worked with Kara in those days, never left the hotel, ever. They did an entire World Bank study on Ethiopia without leaving the hotel. They went one visit to the central bank and talked to them, and they came back, and their thing from the report was, first of all, they didn't understand why I was leaving the hotel. But more importantly, they didn't understand when I said there was lots of liquidity and there's lots of loans and banking operations. They said there isn't any. We went to the central bank. Well, the central bank guy is just like them, stupid as shit. And he never goes out of his office, and he never tries to borrow money either, right? So getting into the field and actually understanding it before you get involved in it, that is not unimportant. But most of those, there's a lot going on normally that you don't have any clue about. So, and microfinance it works in areas where there's a liquidity issue. But in most places now in the world, there isn't a liquidity issue. Like, there's a lot of organizations, a lot of internet-based organizations. There's a lot of phone lending, or I still work with some of them overseas. There's tons of cash floating around. The issue is opportunity or other things. Trade barriers, education barriers, market barriers is the biggie. Which is to be honest, one of the worst things about Canada. We take a lot of well-trained people from other countries and bring them in, and we rob a country of hundreds of thousands of dollars of training dollars, doctors, etc., right? Which is a hideous thing. So if you ever want to fight for actual justice, that would be a good issue.
Now, that last point about how much money Canada takes from different countries just by bringing in trained professionals, I think it's a really complex point.
Super complex.
I mean, people can move where they want to move in the world, and we look at being inclusive in Canada and multicultural in Toronto as such a good thing.
Right? Multiculturalism is like always good, and the open borders and everything like that.
Yeah, clearly it is good, but I never have heard anyone make that point before. And to complicate things even further, when you think about it more, many immigrants can't even practice their professional skill set in Canada due to licensing issues.
So we got this crazy thing where we are like a brain drain on other countries, but then when they come here, they're not even being used to their skill set. So I don't know, maybe we could have like a new Canadian motto, something like Canada, the brain drain for the bathtub of the world.
I don't actually understand what you're saying, but sure.
Yeah, so this is all so complex that you could even make an argument and run with me on this one, right? So if we closed our borders to trained professionals, like other than migrants, right, and like refugees and folks coming from some really bad situations, what if we closed our borders to folks that were professionals? Could that actually improve conditions elsewhere because we're no longer a brain drain?
Yeah, and it's crazy to think about. Let's switch gears here. So Tim also speaks about the reporting from the World Bank and how biased it was against a large institutional data rather than the reality. Thoughts?
Yeah, so clearly Ethiopia's informal market banking system, whatever you want to call it, was overlooked as illegitimate, right? It's not a thing because it's super informal and it's a marketplace. So who would have thought that you could actually exchange like multiple currencies while getting your groceries for the day? I even wonder, like, do you think they would take Canadian loonies?
They probably Google it on the spot and take a healthy profit margin on the exchange rate.
Something like that.
Yeah, so personally, I guess if I ever need to borrow money, I'm heading to tiny markets in Ethiopia.
Totally worth the flight. They give you a good deal on the exchange rate when you go over there. So, anyways, Tim is such an interesting guy, and that's Tim Rudkins, who came in and spoke with us. His entertaining stories were plentiful.
Yeah, and generally the room loved Tim, and I think what they really seemed to appreciate about him was that he was just a straight shooter, and he had a ton of experience, and he was just an all-around hilarious guy.
So for all our listeners, if you want to hear everything that Tim said in his live interview with us, you can find the extended and unrated, I will mention, version of this upcast on our website, doctorsfordoctors.ca, under the Development Works tab. And our Canadian charity strives to do the best international development work possible. And as we continue to learn, we are sharing all of our learnings with you.
And we love to hear from you, so drop us a line on our website and find out where you can see the event live.
And now, updates for the month.
So over in Doctors for Doctors and Nurses for Nurses, we had our AGM in January, and it was only one afternoon this year.
Now, compared to 3 days last year and 6 days the year before, we are exponentially increasing our productivity at AGMs, and I predict next year an AGM of only 2 hours.
I just hope we exist by next year.
Here's hoping.
Now, with the AGM comes rollover work for the new year, and this includes sending money to our local partners in Nicaragua for our 3 medical students. That's Brian, Kimberly, and Brandon.
January is also the month of big plans and small tasks, as I call it. We are rallying the volunteer troops to follow through on all of the projects on our list. So if you're volunteering with us and haven't heard from your manager yet, you certainly will soon.
And thank you again to our entire human resources team for your great work and for being the last team standing at our AGM. Mike, have you heard that we now have an operational plan for the year?
Yes, I was indeed at our AGM where we worked out the entire operational plan.
Huh.
Well, that does it for the update on Doctors for Doctors and Nurses for Nurses. Anything else, Andrew?
Yeah, I think Tim had a really good final thought here.
Although a comment from one of the guys, the finance director of CARE International a number of years ago came from Coca-Cola. They were based out of Atlanta. They tried and transferred over. CARE went to Atlanta. Coca-Cola. So he worked in CARE, and we were having a heart-to-heart one time in Niger about this whole development thing, because that's what you do when you work in development. You're always debating your own existence and whether you're any good, right? Going through existential crises every day. Every day. Every goddamn day you're discussing, am I good? Anyway, so I was chatting with him, and his point was, it's I don't know if we're doing any good, but it's better to be on this side than the other side. So that wasn't a bad point, I thought.
And that's everything for this month's episode of Development Works. Thanks for listening.
This is Andrew and Mike signing off, and remember, if you don't make mistakes, you're not working on hard enough problems.
I remember when we thought that up.